Well, the earliest airplane memories I think that I have is riding with Dad in a side-by-side wheel control airplane, probably an Aeronca Chief, which is kind of strange because we never had Aeronca Chiefs in our fleet. It might have been an airplane we traded for or a customer's airplane, but Frank Silverthorne had just bought an Air Coupe. Of course, the Air Coupe was a little more advanced design than the Cubs and T-Crafts and things. He was pretty proud of its speed, so we had to have a race. And I can remember looking over and seeing that little silver Air Coupe catching up to us and going by us, and I looked over at Dad and I said, "I think we're getting skunked." And that was a phrase that I'd gotten from my grandfather, I guess. But that was a pretty early flying memory. Of course, was around the airport a lot. Was a little one. Lots of course, in that day they weren't antique airplanes. Some old warbird training airplanes, World War II training airplanes. Of course, the Cubs and T-Crafts and all the Luscombs and Stinsons and the things that are now considered classic and antique airplanes. We had a Muncie Mite, which was kind of an unusual airplane to have in the fleet. It was a little single-seat, retractable gear, semi-fighter type looking airplane, and it was quite a treat to fly. And another early memory I have of that, and that's a very small airplane. It was 65 horsepower, single seat. One person could hardly get in it and move around. I rode on Dad's lap in that airplane when he went to inspect a field that he hadn't sprayed before, a farm field, to check for wires and to see the lay of the land before he went and sprayed it. And he kind of rolled over a little bit and went down on the field. And I can remember I really couldn't see too much outside the cockpit, but there was a little hole in the floorboard where the nose wheel came up in, and I could see the ground rushing up through that. And that was quite a thrill. I think I got a big thrill out of that. But anyway, that would have been a pretty good treat to see two of us in that little bitty airplane. Related to the Muncie Mite, it was of course my favorite airplane because it was small and it was neat looking, just like a little fighter plane with a sliding canopy and a stick, and it just really looked neat. We did rent it out, which was kind of pushing the envelope a little bit because it wasn't a tricky airplane, but it was just a little faster than a Cub or a T-Craft. And of course, retractable gear, always worrying that somebody would forget to put the gear down. And one morning, a guy came in and landed, came in a little too slow and dropped in and knocked the gear out from under it. So we all went walking and running down to see what happened, and I was just tagging along behind. And the guy crawled out of the airplane. We were trying to pull it back, and he said, "I just don't know what happened. I just don't know what happened. I was coming in fine." And I guess I was kind of upset. And I guess I looked up at him and said, "Well, you stalled it out. That's what you did." And of course that guy, he came back 20 years later and said, "Did you ever forgive me for tearing the gear out of that little Muncie Mite?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess." But lots of interesting things went on, lots of interesting airplanes and people. I guess really grew up here. I can remember Dad would have to babysit me sometimes, and he'd throw me in the baggage compartment of the Super Cub that we had, which was a 105 horsepower Lycoming, where they normally had a 65 horse Continental engine. And he'd ride with a student, and that was all right if they were doing takeoffs and landings, but in this particular day they were doing some stalls, and the student kind of got a little eager with his stick, and I was kind of bouncing around in the baggage compartment. And I guess I tapped Dad on the shoulder and said, I want to go in. And I can remember walking in. It seemed like I had to walk miles, probably just dropped me out right out in front of the office, but I walked in. And after that, for quite a while, I wouldn't even ride in an airplane. And I was only 5 or 6, or maybe a little more than that. And I didn't really want to ride. I thought, well, if it's going to amount to things like that, I just don't want to go up. And kind of got tricked back into flying. We'd always, of course, test fly an airplane after came out of maintenance, and we'd just gotten a Cessna 140. Side by side, metal fuselage, electric starter, kind of different from the old Cubs and T-Crafts and that. And I was kind of interested in that airplane because it was new to us and different. And he got done with an inspection and said, well, I'm going to taxi this airplane around to the gas pumps. You want to ride around? And I said, no, I don't want to ride. He said, well, I'm just going to taxi to the gas pumps. And I said, well, okay, because I was interested in it and hadn't been in it. And we're taxiing along, and he said, well, I got to run it up a little bit, see how it runs. And I said, we're not going to fly. No. I looked over, no seat belts, so I thought, well, okay. Next thing I know, we were rolling down the runway and flying. And I think I got to handle the controls a little bit. And so after that, well, I was all right. And from then on, well, I wanted to fly more and more. In fact, I think that's what did it, is that I got to handle the controls a little more. Of course, we rode a lot with different people and different airplanes, a lot of the local people. There were times when sometimes you'd want to ride in an airplane, but you'd think, well, maybe I don't want to ride with him. And that would happen, but not too often. Later years, you got a little more serious about actually learning to fly. Got to fly a lot of different airplanes. Of course, finally got my solo and license. And then the first thing I actually obtained was a flight instructor certificate, so that I could help out a little bit on checking people out in airplanes that came to rent airplanes. Because of course the policy and operating procedure was you couldn't let them fly an airplane if you weren't familiar with that person, and some of them were a little different, required a little checkout. So I did a lot of the renter pilot checkouts, because at the time I still had a private pilot's license. I had gotten the instructor certificate on a private pilot's certificate, and they kind of questioned that, but I said, well, according to the way I read the regulations, you can do that. So the examiner said, well, okay, you got your written tests and sign off. So we went and did the flight instructor exam. And later on, they did change the rules so that you had to have a commercial license, which requires you be 18 years old, before you could get an instructor certificate. So I don't know whether that had anything to do with it, or but it was just a technicality in the rules that a private pilot could be a flight instructor. So actually, I was helping out a little bit before I was able to be paid. Of course, as a family business, you really don't get paid a lot anyway, but I got to do a lot of flying, so that was the good part of it. Of course, we did agricultural work, spraying and dusting and seeding, flight training, and air taxi, which was called charter in the old days for local companies and businesses. As I got the commercial license and instrument and multi-engine, well, we got into that more. I never really got to do much of the agricultural flying, which I always kind of regretted. I was flying the airplane and practicing about the time that we actually got out of the ag business. We used our ag plane to tow gliders to a local glider club, so I got to fly it a little bit and always enjoyed that. Always have liked the older airplanes and the tail draggers. Of course, that's what we grew up with. And today, that's still the main thrust of the airplanes here. The home-built, antique classic aircraft, warbird aircraft, even do primary aerobatics and teach some primary aerobatics, which is always fun. So over the years, it's really not changed all that much as far as what goes on at the airport. I guess one other early instance that really gets your attention, a lot of little incidents go on. Some of them are kind of funny, as long as nobody gets hurt. Some things that people do. We used to have the ROTC program, and the head of the ROTC program was an Air Force major, and of course he wanted to keep his flying time in, so he would go to Fort Wayne on Sunday mornings and get a military airplane from the Fort Wayne Reserve Base, and of course he had to come make a flyby of Ball State, and he'd usually come fly by the airport. And one Sunday morning, an F-84 Thunderstreak jet fighter, could hear him coming, of course, came around the airport, and we knew who it was. It was the major, and said, well, this is going to be exciting, because he usually got down there and kind of made it a little low pass with a little smoke and noise and some speed. And it was kind of a busy Sunday morning, and he came around the traffic pattern. He wasn't moving very fast at all. And next thing you know, the landing gear came down, flaps came down, and he flew a regular traffic pattern. He was on final to our longest runway, which was 2,080 feet long, or 2,100 feet long grass strip. And I thought, well, he's giving us a real thrill here. And he progressed with full flaps, smoke billowing out of the engine. The military jets of that day all flew a constant nose-up landing approach, and were really pretty committed to land. And it looked real. And we just all kind of watched and thought, well, maybe he can get it stopped. But he came right down to the runway, and he would have set right close to the end of the runway, and he just poured in a little more power, flew down the length of the runway, pulled his gear up, and went on around. So I think that was one of the occasions that made me think, boy, I think I want to be around that airport all the time. Sunday school wasn't too appealing after that on Sunday mornings, and it was kind of a struggle to get me to go some. But a lot of things went on. Over the years, a lot of people, been some people that were here from the start. Of course, a lot of them have moved on, passed on. There's always been a group, seems to cycle through new pilots. Sometimes there'll be older pilots come back and start flying again. Of course, costs are a big problem anymore. Hopefully the sport pilot license that they're coming out with will make a little more economical for a person to learn to fly that just wants to fly for fun. And that's, even though it was a business, a lot of different aspects of actual general aviation business type flying, it's always been really the fun part of flying that draws them in and keeps them coming. And anybody who solos, I always tell them, I say, well, you've joined the ranks of a few people in all of history who've got it done what you did today, is to fly an airplane solo. And the more you think about it, the smaller that group of people is, really, in proportion to the general population. So flying is something that once it gets in your blood, when you get a taste of it, it just keeps at you.